one of your MCs for the night. I'm an organizing member of No One Is Illegal. Two other co-MCs, and I'll let them introduce themselves before we get started.
Hi, I'm McNally. I will be telling you what the music was, and I'm going to say a little bit about my dad's book.
I'm also a member of No One Is Illegal Toronto, and presently a member of the Fergali household.
Okay, the three songs you heard were War by Hypnotic Brass Ensemble, Capital by the Soul Jazz Orchestra, and Revolution by Nina Simone.
Obviously, if we're going to have a book by David McNally being launched, the three things we need to talk about are war, capital, and revolution.
So we want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know it wasn't easy. Many of us in these winter times with winter blues tend to just stay at home. But given the size of the audience and how everyone's jammed in their standing only room, we can engage the popularity of David. So we're just going to get started right away. We're going to talk about why we're here today and with a couple of speakers. So who has the book already, Global Slump? Oh, that wasn't loud enough, guys. That wasn't loud enough yet. Who has the book? Who's getting the book before the end of the night? Awesome, sounds good. So I'm just going to pass over the mic to Hassan, who's going to introduce our first speaker of the night.
So first up we have Jasook Song, who is a University of Toronto professor in anthropology. She's an author of a number of books that include South Koreans and the Dutch Crisis, and she's also a member of the New Socialist Group. So please put your hands together for Jasook Song.
So I feel very honored to be here to congratulate David's new book as his colleague, friend, and comrade. I want to introduce myself briefly to tell you about the primary connection of my research and David. I'm an urban anthropologist interested in formation of speculating practices of financial capitalism in South Korea. Frankly speaking, I didn't start thinking about using political economic framework when I started writing my first book, second book. But when I noticed that it's very significant, David has been one of the few colleagues and comrades who really nurtured me intellectually to be able to use the critical political economic framework as analytic tools and interpret about what's going on in South Korea. So that's my primary connection to David as a kind of intellectual colleague. But to me, beyond this intellectual industry that we are both putting in, he is truly exemplary leftist organic intellectual. He produces and distributes knowledge through the very practices and participation in the front line and ground level, rather than distant observation or viewing up there. And there's no pretension of his writing and the process of knowledge production. As he said in the introduction of Global Slump, he refuses to talk down to readers, believing that basic issues of political economy should be readily, easily accessible and understandable, in opposition to existing theoretical textbook filled with confusing jargons and mystifying numbers. So he claims that his book is basically not something like The Crisis for Dummies, nor this is not to talk about crisis for ivory tower academics. His goal is to promote critical thinking in precise and accessible languages to wider audiences with a clear vision of collective social change, which I truly admire and fully supported. I just wish I can do it like him. Actually, he came to my book lounge to compliment my book, saying that, well, Jasook's book is very easy to read, follow, it's a good ethnography, which is a big compliment to me because I myself know that I'm still in the disciplinary, very narrowed down, professionalized knowledge industry that I try to make it better, but it's very hard, I know. Anyway, so he kept his promise and commitment to make the important knowledge accessible as a tool of revolutionary method. Reading his book, I found myself constantly nodding to and impressed by his clear articulation on complex and contentious subjects such as neoliberalism and financialization. I am speaking here as someone who heard David's talk on this kind of subject multiple times in the last 2 years through opportunities in popular education and action projects, historical materialism workshops, workers' assemblies, and Toronto News socialist group meetings, in addition to all kinds of street rallies that he spoke in public. So, although I already had a sense of his basic points on these issues, it is amazingly refreshing, and I'm still learning tremendously by reading his book, because I can really see that every time he talks about similar subject, he truly put his efforts to find better ways to articulate effectively and more clearly. This is why I am going to use his book in my classes and strongly recommend you to read and use his book for other many kinds of pedagogical purposes too. From my teaching experiences, there are not many students who are really geared with Marxist political economic framework to understand the current financial crisis. The challenge is that although students are smart enough to know the significance of learning about it, there aren't many political economic texts to lay out those basics and historical updates with recent phenomenon in plain languages. I found particularly his book, Chapter 4. Chapter 4's title is Financial Chaos, and subtitle is Money, Credit, and Instability in Late Capitalism. Very helpful for that reason, to understand what's going on in the global late capitalism. As many of us know, Marx, Hilferding, and Lenin's text on finance capital is very fundamental and classic, but it's not giving us an update explanation of why and what's happening, the most recent crisis and capitalism. And even bourgeoisie, even many bourgeoisie or leftist texts on financialization to capture recent phenomena are still too difficult for my students, and I know for many public intellectuals. So I want to just stress that this is really a path-breaking textbook that is really accessible, and this is an example to show that how knowledge and interpretive activities and practices can be a foundation of revolution that we want to join. And so here's my big congratulations to David for the book production. And I also want to thank to him to give us an exemplary model for being an organic intellectual. And David, you have my true respect from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jasook, for your kind words. And I can say that aside from the collegial nepotism that's usual in academia where you recommend your colleagues' books, David's book is actually exceptional. I promise I'm not biased in this regard. I oftentimes recommend all of David's books to my right-wing family members in particular, as I'm sure many in this room also do, because it actually breaks down concepts that are oftentimes difficult to grasp in a way that's meaningful and relevant to people. And it says, as Jasook said, that it's not made for dummies because he's not talking down to his readers, but it's also not meant for the ivory tower academic. Although I'm sure many ivory tower academics also quote David. And in talking about this new book, one of the things that David really wanted to impress upon people was the fact that as we talk about the financial crisis that's looming ahead and the impacts of it, what we're also looking at is a tremendous resistance movement, both globally and locally. And as an organizing member of known as Legal, before I started, one of the organizations I heard most about was the Ontario Coalition of Poverty, against poverty, sorry. Not of poverty, although sometimes it seems we are in dire times. And one of the organizers in OCAP, which I think we should give a round of applause for, has reached its 20th year last year. So, OCAP for that. It has been John Clark. And I think when I initially started organizing, one of the people that I constantly hear about over and over and over again was John Clark, and how he was this amazing person and all of the things that come with that. And I thought, oh, okay, white, middle-aged man, whatever, it's gonna be, I don't know, we'll see how that goes. And initially, I met John and nothing really happened. I thought, okay, he's nice enough. And then he went up to the podium, and this was, I think, like a rally of 20 people, as sometimes it often is in the winter in Toronto. And I swear, after his speech, I felt it was a rally of millions. Because I was so inspired, I was like, let's just shut this entire city down. And I think that's the type of person John is, and in many ways is an incredibly devoted activist who's been organizing in Toronto over the past 2 decades, and who's an inspiration to most or all of us in this room. So I'd like to welcome John to say a few words.
Thanks very much, but I am young at heart. I sort of didn't take this on as an unbiased observer. I too have an immense respect for David McNally. But I can honestly say that if I didn't know him and I'd never dealt with him, I would have been proud to come and say something about this book anyway, having read it. Because it strikes me, for some of the reasons people have articulated, as being an incredibly important weapon for us in the struggle that lies ahead. Partly because of, as others have alluded to, how it is written and how it is framed. It isn't obscure, but it deals comprehensively with the subject, and it can be the basis for introducing ideas into people who are moving into struggle and initiating the debates that we need to have and clarifying the issues that we need to clarify. So it really is not just a dry volume, it really is a weapon at a time when we desperately need weapons. And one of the things I drew from it in looking over the David's take on the whole period that we have gone through over the last number of decades is that it isn't acceptable merely to say that at the end of the 70s capitalism moved into a crisis that has just been this perennial ongoing crisis. It was able to embark in a period of strengthening and expansion precisely on the basis of imposing defeats on the working class. So it was a period unlike in many ways the period of the post-war boom, but it wasn't based on limited compromise, it was based on the reverse process. It was based on hammering the organisations of the working class, imposing massive debt on the global south, on changing the balance of class forces in favour of capital in many, many ways that were decisive. But nonetheless, it was a period of expansion. And now, in the face of this crisis, as we move into what is described as stagnation and global slump, we are actually moving into a period of crisis in which the working class, bearing the scars of the last 30-some years, is facing what we might characterize as neoliberalism, which is the same methods of austerity, etc., but being imposed in the context not of an expansionary period, but a period of stagnation. And that has, for us, I think, incredible implications in terms, to some degree, of political possibilities, yes, but in terms of the seriousness of what we face. Because the period that has gone by, and I note in the earlier discussion the point was made, that what is happening now in Britain, for example, is being compared to what happened under Margaret Thatcher, and it's being pointed out that Thatcher did nothing compared to what's happening now. Now, if that is the kind of context that we're talking about, the consequences of failing to mobilise a decisive resistance that is able to pose the question of societal transformation, the consequences become infinitely more serious than they were during the last 30 years. Because we're not talking about a relatively incremental process of attacking the working class, we're talking about that being escalated, and we're talking about it being accelerated. And the failure to resist and the failure to respond is going to be a really decisive question. That's the great lesson that I drew from the book. And then in the face of that, David begins to pose some of the questions of resistance that are going to be so decisive and that were referred to in the earlier panel discussion. And in examining what is going on, there are sectoral movements, there are acts of resistance, there are upsurges. Some of them are enormous. They take even the form of general strikes. They take the form of what's happening in Tunisia. But they remain at this point localized, they remain at this point limited. And what we have to create is a movement of global resistance. A movement of global resistance that certainly will have its ups and downs and its backwards and forwards, but certainly will be a movement that decisively is changing, is taking forward new forms of struggle, and is operating on the basis increasingly of a larger and larger core of people within it who have understanding of what capitalism is and why it must be replaced. That's fundamentally, I think, the questions that emerge. And now we have this book. We have this book, it happens to us in the context of ourselves, in our organisation, beginning to think about what we must do and how we must struggle. And we face enormous challenges. And we realise that we can't face those challenges on the basis of woolliness. We can't face it on the basis of not understanding. We must take that understanding into communities that are under attack and transform them into communities of resistance. As such, this book is an incredibly important tool, an incredibly important weapon. I'm proud to speak here about it, and I think we don't just want to buy this book and take it away and read it. We want to think about how we can use it, how we can introduce it, and how we can make it a cornerstone of the struggle that lies ahead. Thank you very much.